Hi folks, my name is Jeremy Massengale, and I'm your host for Kitchen Table Politics. This is the podcast where we all sit around the kitchen table and discuss political ideas. There's this idea out there that to have a successful political podcast, you're going to have conflict, you're going to have drama, you're going to have both sides yelling at each other, calling each other names, not listening to each other to be successful. Well, this is not the podcast for you if that's what you're looking for. It's my hope that I can prove that idea wrong. It's my hope that we, me, you, the audience, and my guests can sit down and have a dialogue about political ideas. Sometimes this may be discussions about parties, or sometimes it may be a show on a specific topic like racism or being charitable. Something my guest and I discussed briefly on today's podcast is the idea of factions. Something we talk about is George Washington's farewell address. Let me read you just a small quote from that address. "Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its root in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed, but in those of the popular form. It is seen in its greatest rankness and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection." I think that's exactly what we're seeing today. We're very polarized and refusing to listen to each other. We're more interested in our party winning than what is best for our country. It's my hope that this podcast can be a catalyst to bring a small amount of civility to political conversations. As President Washington said, the idea of factions is not new. The Constitution was not created by a group of men that agreed on everything. Quite the contrary is true. The ability for these men to negotiate and compromise on issues created one of the most important documents in human history. That being said, I, of course, have a political viewpoint that I feel very strongly about. While I was in elementary and middle school, Ronald Reagan was president, and his warmth and his strength was something that really impressed me and made an impression on me as a young kid. Because of that, I have always voted Republican. I feel very strongly about the Republican Party. Its platform is something that I relate to and what I believe in. But to be honest with you, I don't think the Republican Party, well, at a national level anyway, actually believes in what it says in its platform. It certainly doesn't vote that way. Some of the problems are government spending is out of control, and neither party is willing to do what's necessary. I feel like corporations and special interest groups are being represented and not me. Because of my passion about this and wanting to make a difference somehow, even if just a little bit, I'm putting together a segment also on this podcast called the Republican Report Card. You know, every day the government controls a little bit more of our lives. I don't want to live in a country where little girls can't even set up lemonade stands in front of their house anymore. I don't want to live in a country where people are arrested for feeding the homeless, building ponds on their own land, or catching some rain in a bucket. I don't believe deputies should be going to people's homes because a parent put a little note in a child's lunchbox that had scripture verse on it, or the police being called to a school because a little girl said the word brownie when describing a snack and someone got offended by it. These are all true stories of unreasonable acts by our government, both Democrat and Republican. I want to do this podcast and be involved in politics because I want people to be able to live their lives as free from interference as humanly possible. I want people to be kind to one another and respect each other. I want every person to be fed and have a place to stay, but I don't want force to be used to make that happen. I want the United States to become the greatest and most benevolent country that anyone has ever imagined. And believe me, people, I can imagine a lot, but I think that's what we need to shoot for. You know, I want to cure cancer and all other diseases. I want to create the first trillionaire by mining the asteroids in space. I want us to visit Mars. I want us to create energy sources that are not toxic and and dangerous, but we have to make sure that we don't hurt the economy at the same time. All of this is possible, but we've got to work together. We can't remain 50% of the country believe in one way and 50% of the country believe in a complete opposite way. There are things that we agree on, and we need to sit down and talk about it, and that's what this podcast is for. Before we get to the interview, let's jump into the Republican report card for this week. It's a doozy, and I didn't want to start this podcast, its first episode, as a rant, but the way the Republicans have been voting already in this 115th Congress, I think I'm going to have to. Let's jump right in. All right, first, let's talk about the 114th Congress just a little bit. Their session ended in December, of course, and the new one started in January. The first thing we need to talk about is the defense budget that was passed in December. This thing is unbelievable. This podcast is really going to be devoted to the 115th Congress, so I'm not going to get into the details, but you can go over to congressionaldish.com. That's hosted by Jennifer Briney, and she's doing a wonderful job of keeping up with what Congress is doing. She gives some very detailed accounts of specific laws that are being passed in Congress. She does an exceptional job of just keeping us informed. Now, Jennifer and I don't always agree on the interpretation of what Congress is doing or, have some of the same policy ideas. But as far as general information about Congress, I don't think you can get a better resource. So head on over to congressionaldish.com, look at episode 141, and you'll learn a little bit more about the defense budget that was passed in December. Now, the Republican report card is going to be solely based on what the Republican platform says, okay? So this is just not my opinion or another party's opinion. This is grading the Republican Party based specifically on the Constitution and their own platform. So the first topic I want to talk about Congress has looked at over the last week or so is the free markets. Let me read from their platform about free markets. So it says, competitiveness equals jobs. That equation governs our policies regarding U.S. corporations in the global economy. Okay, so the Republicans, by their own account, they want to create competition for American companies. So, over this first few weeks of the new Congress, they had a bill introduced that would have allowed Canadian drugs into the United States. Now, these drugs are much cheaper and would have opened up the market for competition for our U.S. companies. That's exactly what their platform says, but guess what? They voted against it. That's right. They did not follow their own platform on this vote. Next, let's talk about the repealing of Obamacare just a moment. Now, repealing Obamacare is very complicated, and I'm not going to say it's not. So the Republicans decided to tackle it in a way that basically takes the money away first. It's they're going after the funding instead of the actual law, at least right now. But let's read from the platform what it says about debt and balancing the budget. And I quote, "Our national debt is a burden to our economy and families. The huge increase in the national debt demanded by and incurred during the current administration has placed a significant burden on future generations. We must impose firm caps on future debt, accelerate the repayment of the trillions we now owe in order to reaffirm our principles of responsible and limited government, and remove the burdens we are placing on future generations. The federal fiscal burden threatens the security, liberty, and independence of our nation. The current administration's refusal to work with Republicans took our national debt from $10 trillion to nearly $19 trillion today. Left unchecked, it will hit $30 trillion by 2026, end quote. So from reading that out of the Republican platform, that makes me believe that their biggest priority, or one of their biggest priorities, is cutting the national debt and balancing the budget. Well, there was this bill that came forward, as I said, about repealing Obamacare, and there was a debate about how they wanted to do this. Let's listen to a clip from Senator Rand Paul on the floor of the Senate.
The senator from Kentucky.
The more things change, the more they seem to stay the same. Republicans won the White House. Republicans control the Senate. Republicans control the House. And what will the first order of business be for the new Republican majority? To pass a budget that never balances, to pass a budget that will add $9.7 trillion of new debt over 10 years. Is that really what we campaigned on? Is that really what the Republican Party represents? Our first order of business will be a budget that never balances. A budget that adds $9.7 trillion to the debt, and they tell us, oh, but it's not a budget. If you listen, they will say, no, it is a vehicle to repeal Obamacare. And yet I have the title in front of me. It says a concurrent resolution for the budget of 2017. We have special rules when you pass the budget that we may be able to repeal Obamacare, and I'm all for that. But why should we vote on a budget that doesn't represent our conservative view? Why would we vote on a budget that adds $9.7 trillion to the debt? Because we're in a hurry. We can't be bothered. It's just numbers. I was told again and again, swallow it, take it. They're just numbers. Don't worry, it's not really a budget. And yet, the legislation says it is a budget. The numbers say it will add $9.7 trillion of new debt. And so I say, if they're only numbers, and if the numbers don't matter what's in the budget, why don't we put numbers in the balance? Why don't we put a vision into the budget that represents what Republicans say they are for? Republicans say they are the conservative party. Are we?
As you heard there, Senator Rand Paul discusses that they can not only repeal Obamacare through this budget amendment, but they can also balance the budget in 5 years with his amendment. Well, guess what, folks? The Republicans voted against the amendment to balance the budget. So their plan, as of right now, and this could change, but as of right now, this bill will raise the national debt by another $10 trillion. Now, the Republicans say, well, these are just numbers. We're really not going to raise the debt by that much. But it's in the bill. And they could, when all they had to do was vote for Senator Paul's amendment that would said, yes, we're going to get rid of Obamacare and we're going to balance the budget. But they chose not to do that. They decided to cut down the dead tree of Obamacare by burning down the forest and raising our debt another $10 trillion. How can I give them anything but an F based on their own standards? That is frustrating, folks. But other reports have come out this week. The Hill is reporting that President Trump's new budget is going to focus on cutting spending. Now, that's the only place I've heard that. This is the first time in really his whole campaign that I've heard anything about cutting spending. So if that's true, then I'm hopeful. But it's a shame that our own Congress doesn't have that same idea and that same mentality. So far, anyway. Well, that's enough of my ranting for today. We're going to take a short break for one of our sponsors, and then we're going to get to the interview. Thanks for listening. This episode is brought to you by Amazon.com. Do you like shopping online and supporting political dialogue? Well, Kitchen Table Politics and Amazon.com has partnered up so that you can do both at the same time with no additional cost to you. Here's how it works. Go to ktpolitics.com and click on the Amazon tab. Then shop on Amazon just like you intended. Amazon will give the show a small portion of the proceeds. It's that simple. Again, it doesn't cost you anything extra, so you are supporting the show just by shopping as you normally would. Now, please enjoy the rest of the show. Welcome, folks, back to the podcast. I'm with Josiah Augustine today. He is a PhD student working on a political science degree. Josiah, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Josiah, I want to start a little bit talking about political history for you. How you grew up, where you're at now,
Sure.
What your philosophy is.
Right. Yeah, so I grew up overseas in the former communist countries of Bulgaria and the Czech Republic. My parents were missionaries for most of my life, and then we moved back here to the South halfway through my high school. And so I've always been conservative, fundamentally, but having been exposed to politics in Europe, I had a different kind of imagination than what a lot of people here have when they kind of follow party lines. So I kind of saw a benevolent state over there. I cared a lot about, social help. Like for single mothers, we actually cooperated in Prague with a single mother shelter over there, for instance, that was actually had state assistance, and so on and so forth. But coming back to the States, I kind of saw a very special society where not everything seemed to rely on the government as much. There's this disaggregated society where, so much relies on, like people have a local identity more than they do in Europe a lot of the time. And so I kind of wanted to have my cake and eat it too. See, take the good from Europe, where people didn't feel bad about using government in some way to help others, but at the same time, not centralizing so much. And so I guess I find myself being something of an independent who leans conservative, especially on social issues, but I'm willing to actually think that the government, on some level, not the federal government, but on some level should be involved in providing a safety net for individuals. So,
right. What do you think it is about most Americans that feel that the government should not be involved in those programs?
Yeah, well, I think Americans are very independent. They're not the only very independently driven nation in the world. I think there are quite a few, but Americans really have this sense in which, that I think comes from England. When one is in their house, they are in their castle, essentially.
Right.
And so you are the lord of your castle, and so you don't want anybody else to really force you to change and structure your life. So I think people have this mentality of, their lives are what they are completely sovereign over, and if the government demands a whole lot of them and they feel it is shaping the way they live their life, they're going to resent it. They will naturally resist it. So I think it's from the English tradition, honestly, in a lot of ways.
While George Washington was leaving office, he gave a pretty famous speech about
The farewell address
about factionalism and the dangers of that. Is there a difference in Europe it seems more fractured there with more political parties than it does in the U.S. Is it?
There's a few reasons for that. One is purely institutional. I can get to, there's societal reasons too, but the first is they use different electoral systems. The electoral system here in America is what we call majoritarian. In other words, suppose even you had 6 candidates, the person who would win is the one who gets the most votes, or a plurality. Whereas in Europe, very often, for legislative elections, there is more than one seat available in a given district, which means that if you come in second place, or third place, or so on and so forth, depending on the number of seats that are in a district, you might still win a seat. And so there are more parties that get into the legislatures than do here. Whereas if only one person's going to win an election here in the States, well, you're going to have a 2-party system. Ultimately, that's actually one of the only laws of political science as a discipline, is that if you have electoral districts where there's only one seat, you're going to end up having only 2 parties. So that's part of the reason why America seems to be less fractionalized. On societal reasons, Europe is very interesting in terms of how people's identity is shaped by so many things. Even the soccer clubs they cheer for is based off of where they live, what economic class they are, who their parents, what party their parents are members of. I think that a lot of times European parties are built by this almost social division system. And so I think the society as a whole is maybe a lot more divided on the basis of economics. Like you have industrial workers, you have people who are in the business sector, you have other people, and each one really seems to, one of those identities corresponds to a party identity, in some cases even a football identity, and so on and so forth. So it's a very segmented society in a very economic sense. There's this division of labor, a division of ideology that I don't think exists here. So that I think is part of the reason why Europe is so much more diverse, because of the electoral systems allow for more parties, but then also, there's just a lot of identities out there just based off of economic identity, whereas here, a poor person could vote Republican or Democrat, it feels like, honestly.
Right. Speaking of the Electoral College or electors, recently there's been a lot of talk about the need or not need of that system. What's your thoughts on that?
I personally come on the side of the Electoral College pretty strongly, actually, simply because of the fact this is a vast country. This is a very large country, and each section of that country has very different opinions, very different needs. And I think that our population, however, is not very spread out. It's very coastal. And really, you see the design of the institutions of the United States really decides to equalize the playing field for areas that don't have high population. We have the Senate, obviously. It doesn't matter how big a state is in population, they get the same number of senators as other states, because tyranny of the majority is something that perplexes, the founders to no end. You can read the Federalist Papers and see them talk about this, and I think that the Electoral College, by giving more votes, more weight in elections to smaller parts of the country by population than they would in a purely referendum type election, I think that this is one of the very fundamental checks that we have on allowing our society to get completely polarized and neglect, say, the Midwest, neglect flyover country, as it's been dubbed in the aftermath of this election. So I think that I don't see it as less democratic. I think people really complain about the Electoral College, say it's less democratic because the will of the people is being overruled in some sense, because obviously Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College vote. I think, however, at the same time, you could make an argument that it is actually balancing, giving each one of the viewpoints in this country a voice, and making sure that they are not irrelevant in any way. And by the way, I do think the Electoral College very much does factor into account population. California has 55 Electoral College votes. Tennessee only has 11, I believe. Right. So, it's not it's not near as egalitarian, say, as the Senate. So I think it's a very smart system, personally, and yeah, I just don't think that urban centers should be the only places that really rule the country.
Right. Maybe not all of our listeners have read the Federalist Papers. Can you expand on that idea of tyranny of the majority?
Yeah. So when they were drafting the Constitution of the United States, it had been some years after the independence of the colonies, and so they had a document called the Articles of Confederation that essentially got them through the American War for Independence, but essentially each of the states were separate, countries that happened to be in a loose alliance, and each one had their own currency. Everything was just so different. There wasn't really a strong central government, and that just did not seem sustainable over the long term. So there were these concerns, however, that this government would be too powerful. I mean, the United States, these colonies had just thrown off what they felt was an oppressive yoke of the British, and now they didn't want to erect this massive big state. So one way that they tried to, one of the big debates that came about was, and this was a concern especially of smaller states, of southern states that didn't have high populations, that were mostly more agrarian, and smaller coastal states, was that essentially the big states like Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, the economic powerhouses of these colonies, were going to basically run the show entirely and overrule the concerns of smaller states. And so we obviously have a very strong concern in this country for minority rights. We have the Bill of Rights, things that are inalienable. And this was part of a compromise that tried to establish that no group could be oppressed. And not only did we put these kind of rights that couldn't be violated, we also put institutional checks and balances that would allow these small states to affect the outcome of elections, affect the outcome of legislation, so as to prevent states from, or majorities from, literally not caring about the opinions of minorities because they weren't needed to pass a bill in Congress. They weren't needed to win a presidential election. So, yeah, the tyranny of the majority essentially was a concern about, making sure that these various interests that came to the table in the Constitutional Convention, and obviously came into the Union subsequently, would be able to feel as though they weren't losing their sovereignty, that they weren't losing any kind of control over their future. They weren't subjecting themselves to just essentially new imperial control.
Mm-hmm. Studying the Founding Fathers and the Constitutional Convention, that area and that time period, do you think that we are still following, if not the letter of what they intended, but the spirit of it at the very least?
Not quite. There's been a couple big departures. One is, I think, and a lot of people have talked about this, but it's the role of the court changing a lot. The court as being essentially this, not just a body that, just reviews whether the letter of the law is being changed, but really kind of this agent of changing the law, really a legislative body. They call it legislating from the bench, for instance. Like that's one way in which we've taken what was supposed to be an apolitical office and made it a partisan office in a lot of ways. You heard so many times over the course of this election that the Supreme Court was at stake. We need to put a liberal justice, or we need to put a conservative justice that will do X, Y, Z. And X, Y, Z is on the party platform. Essentially, they're trying to elect somebody to this office that happens to have a lifetime appointment. That's not what was intended initially. Initially, it should have been irrelevant who the president was, fundamentally. This person is supposed to be secure from all of these partisan interests and not really bring any kind of new ideological spin on their job, but really just kind of look and see, okay, the way this bill was passed, was it consistent with such and such part of the Constitution or past law? That obviously has changed. Another thing that has changed a lot is we have moved more towards a centralized national model where politics is happening more on a national scale than it used to. It used to be we definitely delegated a lot to the states in terms of how politics was going to be run. And also, when I talk about the tyranny of the majority and institutional checks on majority opinion, one of the ways that kind of went away was in the election of senators. Senators used to be elected by state legislatures. They were not elected by popular vote in their states. And so, that is another way in which the states as entities, are not as represented as they used to be. And, that was those two changes primarily in the nature of those institutions, the Senate and the courts, I think have really kind of made America less of it's become more of a national politics, kind of where everything is happening on the national level, than when it used to be really kind of split up more on the local level, that the federal government was overseeing this group of states that had joined a union, but within each state, policy on education and various other policy areas was really kind of a local concern. We've definitely moved beyond that, and national elections, I think, have become more and more important to people over time. So I don't think that's what the founders imagined. I think they imagined a lot more disaggregated nation and much more disaggregated politics rather than this concentration in federal institutions.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me that they did not want an equal amount of power between each branch. To me, it seems obvious that Congress was supposed to be the more powerful branch of the government, followed by the executive, right, and the judiciary being the least powerful.
Right.
That seems to have changed.
Yeah.
I think it's almost switched to where the judicial may be on top of the power struggle there.
Yeah. One of the more interesting things that I noticed looking back at the Obama administration especially is that, a lot of the things that will go down as part of his legacy, namely the redefinition of marriage, for instance, in Obergefell, that was not something that he did through executive agency. That did not come about through an executive order, and it certainly didn't come through the Congress. It came through the courts. Mm-hmm. It was one of the major reforms of recent American history that did not come through, like you say, this primary body, this legislative. Also, we can look back at the abortion issue as well. Again, an issue that came through the courts and struck down in the process state laws, and definitely asserted the dominance in that moment of this judiciary over the states, over the state legislatures, which you can make an argument the states were being represented through Congress as well. So it was also a dominance of the judiciary over Congress, and it's very difficult to change the Constitution, as we well know. Mm-hmm. It hasn't been changed since, I guess, the Clinton administration, with a very uncontroversial 27th Amendment to the Constitution that just regulated the pay of legislators. But even things that had a lot of groundswell of support, such as the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s, could not pass 3/4 of the states,
right,
and get a 2/3 majority in Congress. So it's definitely a very difficult situation from the perspective of how would you restore, the original balance of power, because the court sits behind a very, very long, lengthy process of ratifying an amendment to the Constitution that was really the only way you could overturn something from the court. Mm-hmm. And so I think when people say that in a presidential election, what's on the line is overturning Roe v. Wade, they just don't understand that this is beyond the realm of executive power. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter who is in office as president. They cannot overturn Roe v. Wade. In order to do something like this, you would actually have to have a 2/3 majority in Congress vote for something, and then 3/4 of the states. That's a lot.
Right.
That's almost unprecedented in our more recent history. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think because of that, the judiciary really is able to have the final word on a lot of matters.
Let's circle back to the Senate for just a moment. Mm-hmm. You had mentioned that the Senate at one time was appointed by the state legislatures. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that changed?
Well, I think it was changed. It was changed during the Woodrow Wilson administration. It had come on the heels of a lot of reforms already, such as the primary system had been introduced just prior to that. And the reason for both of those reforms, including the election of senators and introducing a primary system instead of just having a convention to pick the candidate, for a certain office, was because parties were very corrupt. Parties' bosses were basically deciding who was going to get to go to office. A state legislature, well, again, politics was being done in smoky back rooms, and whoever was sent as a senator to Washington very often tended to be somebody who had done their time, serving the interests of the party primarily, and may not have had any popular support. And as time went on, people became increasingly aware of this corruption. And so this was a way of trying to, fix a broken party system at the turn of the century. Which, by the way, the parties were something that the Founding Fathers did not quite foresee. They knew that there would be factions. They knew that there would be different groups, entities, contesting power. But they didn't understand the degree to which parties were going to shape the politics of the Republic after the founding. They really envisioned this situation where, ordinary people or, educated, well-respected members of the community would run, but they wouldn't be subservient to some other interest, like we see, senators and representatives being subservient to their parties. They really kind of wanted a system that was more organic. It came straight from communities toward office, and the changing of the way the Senate works may have been because, simply put, the Constitution couldn't function as it was intended with the existence of political parties. Mm-hmm. So it was an attempt to rectify that.
Even though I don't want to get into the details of this past election, sure. This podcast is not about personalities or even choosing sides. But there was an increase in at least the possibility of third-party candidates being looked at this past election cycle. Are there any of those that you yourself looked at and kind of, maybe?
Yeah. Well, here in Tennessee, not all of them were on the ballot, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. Not all of them were even valid write-in candidates. And so that restricted some of my options. But when I looked kind of at unrestrained at who was out there amongst third-party candidates, a group that really caught my eye was the American Solidarity Party. Their candidate was Mac Maturin this past election cycle. Again, they were not valid write-in candidates this time around, but I was very drawn to their platform. And also I liked Evan McMullen as well. Mm-hmm. They weren't a party, but was also very interesting.
What was it about the American Solidarity Party that caught your eye?
Well, I think that their platform was pretty well articulated by and large. They appealed to certain pillars of their ideology. One was that really caught my eye was subsidiarity. Now, subsidiarity is essentially an idea that is similar to states' rights, the idea that the federal government should not be in charge of everything. The federal government should not be the one doing everything, providing all the services, and regulating every aspect of political life. But instead of states' rights, subsidiarity says not only should the states manage this, But actually, this should be done on a local community level. And I think that that's wise because in an extreme form, arguing for states' rights can turn into a situation where instead of having a federal government in Washington that's very disconnected from the realities that people face in everyday life, you kind of erect a smaller version of the federal government in a state capital. And it's just as ineffective. It just happens to have a more manageable task on its hands. I find that problematic, honestly, just to say that Nashville should have all the sweeping powers of the federal government and be as in control of various aspects of life as, the federal government is today. I think it is good to have a party out there, like the American Solidarity Party, that articulates a vision of fundamentally restructuring American politics away from this model that is government-centric, not just simply saying we need a smaller government equals a federal, basically a smaller version of the federal government on the state level, but actually looking toward giving communities more and more agency and discretion over how they're going to manage various issues. Because, quite honestly, for certain issues they seem to be the most competent, and there will be the most accountability. Because there's a more direct access from citizens to somebody who, say, is on the school board, than from citizens to somebody who is sitting in the legislature all the way in Nashville. So I was very fond of that idea, as well as their ideological basis is very conservative. It's based in Christian democracy, like it is in Europe. But I think that combination was something that I really hope earnestly in the future was not just a fluke of 2016, but was something that will actually enter the conversation moving forward.
Well, you had talked about in Europe, smaller parties like that have a much better chance of surviving and actually being placed inside a legislature or getting elected at some point. In the United States, it's pretty much impossible for that to happen, but at least they can have a message and make make a point to the American people. It's interesting that you said they have a kind of Christian idea or viewpoint of elections. Looking from the outside in, of course, neither one of us are part of that party or understand the internal workings of it. But in the United States, to say that your viewpoints are Christian, to me, that kind of maybe alienates a big section of the population, which from the get-go puts you behind everyone else. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, so let me just understand really quickly. Are you saying essentially that if you say that you have a Christian viewpoint, that you're going to alienate non-Christians, or that you're going to alienate people who, what exactly are you?
We'll say non-Christians.
Okay.
That's a big part of your population that's going to automatically not read anything you say if that's the first line of your your tagline or whatever.
Yeah. It is notable that the American Solidarity Party did not choose the American Christian Democratic Party as their name. I think that at the end of the day, it's less offensive to tell people that you are informed by Christian values, and that is immediately followed in the same sentence as, care for your neighbor and, Christian values of human dignity, which really, honestly, Christian values, because they are so prominent in the West, they really kind of lead to Western values in a lot of cases, are the foundation for a lot of uncontroversial, at least in the West, values such as human rights. And so I think there is a way that you can pitch it that isn't so controversial, but nonetheless you can mention where it comes from. And I think that people are willing to lend you their ears for a bit, because the way the Christian right, by contrast, and that is since the 1980s pitched themselves, is very different. I don't think that there was any kind of attempt to explain where their intellectual tradition came from. It was really Christianity was a banner more than it was an ideological platform in a lot of ways. And that was alienating to people, because they basically saw this group essentially as not making a pitch, not trying to actually gain more support. It's like, we are already in this group, and now we want political representation. I think that the American Solidarity Party, or any party for that matter, that does take an explicit inspiration from Christian values, can take a much more compelling approach by being clear and unambiguous about its philosophical roots, but at the same time, doing this in a way that explains where their platform is coming from, rather than just trying to use it as a banner. Because I think that a lot of people, honestly, religious or not religious, would find a lot in the platform that they would agree with, that they really wish that alternative view of American politics were a reality. I think that I don't think that you have to hide the word Christian as a party.
One of the things that has really been on my mind lately, especially, there's been a lot of thoughts of removing the Ten Commandments from courthouses. Anything that is Christian at all needs to be removed from the public viewing. I can understand their point, coming from that side. Yes, there needs to be a separation of church and state.
Sure.
I agree with that. But to me, that means that the state can't force you to be a particular religion.
Right.
To see a particular religious sign in a courthouse or a public square is not forcing religion upon you. And the Ten Commandments being in the courthouse, I think it's a lot more, to me personally, than just this is in the Bible, this is important.
Right.
The writers of the different books in the Bible did a very good job, I think, of showing how a society can be damaged by certain acts. It's not about you break a rule and you're going to get in trouble. That's not what sin is to me. It's not breaking a rule. It's if these things continue, your society is going to be damaged because of it.
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of people would object to that, even in the sense that they wouldn't, if they don't see as a legitimate basis for which one objects to, or identifies, I should say, the things that are damaging society, then, they will see it as a religious statement that is contradicting their life, So, for instance, if they're not compelled that sexual freedom, as they would call it, it should be restrained in any way, then, they don't want to see that on their courthouse, essentially. And, my view on it, my view on why, maybe if there's a defense for keeping Ten Commandments up in courthouses and things like this, probably differs from yours in the sense that, the reality is this country definitely has a Christian legacy. That doesn't necessarily mean it is a Christian country. I don't think that its institutions exalt a particular religion. However, by consensus, at one time when these courthouses were built, this is what people, put up as a symbol of, the law. And I don't think that this country right now and its culture respects its past very much. I think this country is very ashamed of its past. And I think in the modern world in general, we have lost the ability to look at the past and admit mistakes. Say, for instance, Germany is struggling with its legacy from the Second World War, or the United States is struggling now with its legacy of slavery, or its legacy of its genocide against Native Americans. But the fact of the matter is, these processes went on during a fundamental building of this country, and those institutions still remain. And I don't think it is good to erase history. I don't think it is good to erase statues of people, who have built this country. Or, in this case, symbols that were foundational to this country. And, we cannot forget where we came from. If we update all of our cultural symbols to be in sync with the cultural values of 2016, I can't see how that isn't damaging to us, because it tells us that we must disown our ancestors wholesale because they had a quote-unquote primitive view on a particular set of issues. Can I say that the way that, if it's true that the Scarlet Letter, Puritan New England was an accurate representation of that time, can I say that, okay, the way that they interpreted and used Scripture as a legal basis was oppressive and, terrible, et cetera, and yet still appreciate, the fact that our institutions in some way are influenced by them, or that I in some way have to respect that, I think that I should be able to do both. Mm-hmm. Even if someone is non-religious, does not subscribe to any authority, that there's any authority in the Ten Commandments, I think they should be able to, feel comfortable knowing that where our institutions are now do descend from something that may be at odds with what this country is today or what they want this country to be. I think that they have a right, to change these institutions. We have a constitution that set forth processes for redefining this country, passing new laws, and so on and so forth. But I don't think that we need to erase, the legacy that we have, even if it is fraught with various detestable things. And so even if somebody finds the Ten Commandments to be a terrible, to represent something terrible to them, I don't think it's healthy to deny, reality. Mm-hmm. That this country very much was built on that this symbol mattered.
Right.
So that's a broader issue, I suppose.
Sure. Kind of wrapping up, if there's one thing that you think would be beneficial to where we are now and where we're headed and what we can do as citizens to get us there, what do you think it would be?
That's a very difficult question.
It is a very difficult question.
How to fix America. How to make America great again.
Yeah, right. Well, let's say to make America greater than it ever has been.
Honestly, I think that it would be very beneficial if we could find a way to get around the fact that our own lives are so polarized. That American society is polarized because our own lives are so segmented. Increasingly, you talk to people who are either very liberal or very conservative, or, in other words, they have very different visions of this country going forward. They have very different opinions. You try to find out how many friends they have on the other side. You try to find out how many times they actually interact with and are challenged by an opinion so antithetical to their own. Or, by contrast, how many times they do actually challenge somebody who doesn't hold their opinion. How many times they actually are in the trenches of a conversation with somebody they disagree with. You find out it's very, very rare. Even on their Facebook feed, they hardly have friends very often that disagree with them. And even if they do know people who are very, very different from them, who have a very different opinion about things, they don't actually interact and engage with them. Mm-hmm. This democracy was not founded on being able to just kind of have your own faction and then take complete control. And once you are in control, say of the legislature or something, then you're just able to have your way. This system is designed for engagement across ideas, and for that to produce results, laws, policies, etc., that the whole country essentially can put their stamp on because the whole country was engaged in making it in some form or fashion. That just hasn't happened. I think one thing we can do to fix American politics and bring it closer back to what the Constitution intended by this, give and take of both sides, is for people to really, in their own personal lives, engage with other ideas. Because if we can't engage, how on earth are our politicians going to? They seek our votes. And if they find out that the way that they can win elections is by, taking the most non-conciliatory tone possible and demonizing the other side, they're going to do it. And when they get to Washington, because they want to get reelected, they're going to keep doing that. And it's going to be detrimental to our democracy. And so, I think it starts with the American voter. It starts and ends with the American voter.
Very well said. That is exactly why I even wanted to start this podcast, is just to have conversations with people that I don't agree with. Yeah. And, you and I line up very close to what I believe. Sure. But I hope that with every guest that I have on, I can have a dialogue with someone who believes differently than I do. Yeah. And I hope that the American people can sit around the kitchen table here with us and join the conversation. Yes. It's extremely important to me, especially after everything that we've seen over the last election cycle. Mm-hmm. It's very nasty, very vile, and, there's a better way of doing things.
There is.
Well, Josiah, thank you so much for being with me today. I appreciate your views and what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Bye-bye. I certainly hope you enjoyed this episode of Kitchen Table Politics. Please give us a follow on Twitter at KTPTP POLS, that's KT Polls, and check out our website, ktpolitics.com. We'll see you next time.